Chapter 15. Dr. Frank. Hannah gave birth at the beginning of the following summer. I'd like to say we were met with the joy and delightful anticipation I had offered so many couples in our position, but our moment of rapture and love was stillborn. Because we had no idea what this child would mutate into, during her pregnancy, Hannah read obsessively about gigantism and acromegaly, until I pried the books from her hands after she'd fallen asleep. The only time I would venture to touch her again. At times I heard her on the phone, whispering, but the minute she heard my footsteps pass near her spare room, she'd stop speaking. She must have been sharing something with someone, her parents, about what I had done that she did not want me to overhear. She continued to sleep in the spare room throughout the duration of her pregnancy. Stacks of books on doulas, home births, and general guides on IVG, IVF, and rare genetic disorders on the 2 nightstands on each side of the small bed where she slept. She never left that room. I believe it was so she could hide herself from me and our creation from the world, since we had no idea whether this creation would be fit for society. I often wondered what attachment, if any, she was forming with the creature building inside of her. We barely spoke more than a few words to one another. She continued to let me examine her for her routine checkups, and she asked after the development of the child following each appointment. We hired a queer black midwife, Silber, who Hannah found on her own without consulting me. She trusted in Silber to keep the circumstances of this unique birth confidential, and her skills to aid us in whatever complications might arise. I greatly grieved Hannah's touch and attention, but I was far too occupied with my own fears as to how this child I had spent my life's work building would turn out. All of that effort only for Ezra to ruin everything I had built. For the most part, all of the ultrasounds I performed on Hannah leading up to the birth did not depict anything out of the ordinary, although her belly was already protruding in ways that seemed surprising for her petite frame. Early in the pregnancy, it looked as though Hannah might even have twins, which brought me great excitement, for I hoped it would mean that if one egg were to have the genetic mutation, perhaps the other would be saved. But later on, we would learn that one egg had vanished, consumed by the other. Those eggs felt, in some way, like Ezra and me. I thought we would always be each other's darlings, but it seemed we were in a fight to the death, one our father had started, but that would continue long after he died. Who would win? The size of the creature inside Hannah's belly gradually became a concern to us both, one we had negotiated on our own and separate spheres since I discovered the possibility of a genetic disorder. Hannah was already so big, even a full month before her due date, that after careful consideration, I brought in Silber for her urgent guidance. Silber was in her mid-40s. Because we called her so late into the pregnancy, she came to the door that day dressed for anything. Her usual bright silk fabrics were replaced with a set of functional scrubs, her hair kept out of her face with a simple black head wrap. She brought a simple canvas tote bag with her, slung across one shoulder, and without so much as offering a greeting, she ran into Hannah's room. "Silber, thank God you're here!" Hannah screamed out to her with one hand clutching her belly, the other reaching out for Silber, who swiftly ran to her side. "Darling, how are you? I hear you're quite full and still a month to go. Let me have a look," Silber said, measured and calm. Pressing a firm hand on various parts of Hannah's belly, Silber asked Hannah to breathe into her hand again and again, giving her nods of encouragement as she examined her. "Good, that's good. Now let me just listen to your heart, take your pulse and your blood pressure," she said, going into her bag and grabbing her stethoscope and her blood pressure monitor. She didn't say a word for several minutes. "Z, where are you?" she called out to me. I ran into Hannah's room from the kitchen, where I had been pacing, trying to give both of them space and privacy during the examination. I'm here. How's the baby?" I looked at Hannah, who looked away from me, towards the window. Silber took out a vial of soap and a pair of gloves. "That baby needs to get out. I'm not sure how it's grown so large already, but Hannah said there might be some sort of genetic defect." "Not defect," I said brusquely, without realizing my tone. Silber raised one eyebrow at me. "Sorry, No, not defect, a possible genetic mutation that could result in a disorder of gigantism. Ah, okay. I wish you would have given me this information sooner. Hannah assumed you had already advised me. Very well, then. I think we have no choice but to induce. Now. I will do my best to do this on my own, but it is possible, given the nature of the baby's condition, that she will need a hospital, she said, walking over to the bathroom sink and carefully washing her hands. She then fitted each glove over her hands. Hannah screamed out in protest. Silver walked back over to her, holding her hand. I'm sorry, darling. I really will do the best I can to bring this baby into the world as safely as I can. You have my promise. We will do what we can, but there is still a chance you will need hospital care, okay? But let's see what we can do first. Silver touched Hannah's face. I was struck with a pang of jealousy, but I willed it to pass. Hannah nodded. How can I describe what a catastrophe this pinnacle moment, this moment I had been waiting my entire life for, became? The creature's head was too large and unwieldy to fit through the birth canal, and Hannah was under major duress and pain. We had no choice but to rush Hannah to the hospital for an emergency C-section. When we got to the hospital, I could tell by the look on the admitting doctor's face that this was not something he dealt with on a regular basis. It was at that moment that Hannah finally looked back at me. We shared a silent glance, a shared feeling of tremendous fright, for we knew that the genetic mutation of this child was not altogether unexpected. Now that we were certain it was here, there was no denying it. But then came the release of blood that was the result of this distorted creature and the responsibility of that boy, little Ezra, who had for so many years brought so much charm and joy into my life. Sweat began to pour from the top of Hannah's head during the procedure. The doctor struggled furiously to pull the enormous being out of Hannah's swollen belly, while Silver remained by Hannah's side, stroking her hand and coaxing her through it. At times, the doctor would ask Silver to assist, but mostly she just remained of support to Hannah, for which I was grateful. Hannah certainly had not warmed toward me, not even now, even when so much was at stake. I suppose, looking back, the more dangerous and painful the childbirth became, the colder she became towards me, the reason for its acceleration. I had never seen so much blood in my life. It was a grotesque sight I hoped to never revisit. Good God, what I thought would have been the most perfect specimen. The creature's eyes were indeed blue, as I had hoped, but there was an eerie hollowness to them, like staring into a dazzling crystallized light. Its complexion was an intriguing dark blonde color, but the amount of reddened hair sprouting from its head and belly was disconcerting to say the least. Its belly button protruded an inch from its body, and its rib cage caused its torso to stick so far out I could only describe its manner as absolutely wretched. The infant's hands were abnormally large, while its feet, shockingly, remained a more expected size. The only comfort I had at this hideous sight was also a tragedy. Hannah had lost so much blood during the C-section that she didn't survive through the procedure long enough to even see this monster the doctor placed in my hands before he fled the scene. For so many years, I had worked at nothing else other than my attempt at creating the perfect creature, one untouched by a man either in the creation of the embryo or in its delivery. In the end, I lost control over both of these variables. It was these factors that led to my poor creature's ruin and ugliness. In order to accomplish this, I had kept all whom I loved far from me, and I had sacrificed all sense of wellness and happiness. But now that the creature was in front of me, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. From Frankenstein. Unable to endure the aspect of the being I had created, and over whose perfection I was unable to fully control, I took the infant, covered in a white sheet, into my arms and rushed out of the room. Because I had long held a certain kind of authority in the town, I was easily recognizable to most healthcare professionals. Most knew how important I was to the birth industry. As I walked the hallways of the hospital, I could see the shock held on the faces of the nurses and the hospital administrative staff, who had clearly already been told what had transpired in that room between me, Hannah, Silver, and the attending doctor. I emitted some sort of energy or held some reaction on my face indicating that whatever it was I held in my arms, shielded from view with a thin white bedsheet, was so horrible and unseemly that no one asked after me or questioned why I was leaving without filling out the appropriate paperwork. This was not a creature I wanted to claim. I did not want my name attached to any birth certificate for this bundle tucked under my arm. No social security number. No proper identification. This creature killed my love and was marked with the poison of my brother, my cousin, my darling Ezra, who had become a stranger before my very eyes. Perhaps he had always been one. I would never see this thing our sick, twisted triangle had made, separate from Hannah's gruesome death and Ezra's manipulation, the sole reason for this thing's monstrousness. This creation was coated in the sheen of tragedy and destruction, for now and all eternity. Everyone knew not to stop me or question what I hid between my hands. I'm sure they remained silent and unmoving in fear of what could be so terrible to be hidden from the world by its own creator. As I raced out of the room, I heard Silber, who had silently remained with Hannah, frozen in shock and grief at Hannah's death, cry out after me. But I think she knew, after what she had witnessed, that there was no use catching me. We knew we would never see each other again. We would never speak of what we had experienced together in that sterile room. I hoped to never return to this place again. I didn't look back to see if she had run after me or if she remained glued to the chair by Hannah's side. I ran to a nearby forest. In a state of frenzy and confusion, I left the newborn at the base of a tree, telling myself I would return for it after I cleared my head. I would figure out what to do then. I returned to the hospital to tend to Hannah's body, but I knew in my heart that nothing could bring me back to the tree, that hideous being, and the scene of the failure of my own dream and love. After roaming the streets for several hours with no purpose or destination in mind other than to flee what I had witnessed and erase it from my mind, I finally exhausted myself and walked the long distance homeward, hoping it would help me sleep off this nightmare. A little part of me wished I would wake up to discover it had all been a most terrible dream, that Hannah and the unborn baby were still with me, that she loved me again, that I had thrown away the embryo that contained Ezra's sperm and told her everything from the beginning so we could just start again. Instead, as I slept, I was tormented by the most disturbing visions. I saw little Ezra, as he was from so long ago, when my father and grandmother were still alive. But it was as though his and my father's faces had merged into one pair of piercing eyes of blue. Having not seen my father in so long, I immediately went to embrace him without thinking. But as I pulled away to greet him properly, I discovered holes where his eyes should be, his flesh rotting off his bones. I spent the rest of the night monstrously. For days afterward, I feared I would fall into an unconscious state from the agony I experienced then. My pulse sped, my eyes could not rest long on a subject of focus. I felt such striking grief at all that I had lost. Hannah, little Ezra, but most of all, the bitter and disappointing distance between how I had imagined my creation and what demonic reality took its place instead. At some point, I felt an indefinable remorse at leaving a defenseless infant in the woods with no sustenance or comfort, even one as hideous as that which I had made. And so, one night, shortly after the creature's birth, I stole away from my apartment in the middle of the night. I imagine if anyone had come upon me, I would have looked dreadfully sallow and hysterical with a certain wildness in my eyes. By the time I reached the tree where I had set the baby and the white sheet from the hospital, the wretched thing was gone, the sheet wrapped around one of the tree's branches, making a whipping sound in the wind. Although visions of the wretched being I had made fluttered into my consciousness from time to time, for the most part I spent the next many years trying to shut the horrid incident out of my mind completely. I continued on with my work. I kept my distance from my mother and Ezra, for there was no way I could forgive Ezra for what he had done. And I could imagine no way to explain to my mother all that had transpired between us. I didn't know if Ezra realized the extent of his destructive act of revenge. I had no idea what had become of him since his heinous act. I often wondered if he assumed I destroyed the embryo once I inevitably realized he had sabotaged my efforts. Did he ever wonder what became of his vile material? I assume, like most men, that he went about his life without giving a moment's attention to all he had destroyed or the life he might have created, except, perhaps, some self-satisfaction at having caused me pain in exchange for my refusal of his proposal. He knew he could never force me to marry him, not here, not like my father forced my mother to wed him so many years ago. Those years following the birth were the darkest I had ever experienced. I no longer engaged with my employees, or, for that matter, anyone. With Hannah, I buried my chance at a future with another. How could I merge my life with anyone else after what I'd allowed to happen to her? I killed her. Or rather, I allowed her to become collateral damage in the pursuit of creation and ambition. And for what? Why was nature so cruel as to allow her to die and then leave me to live my agony? Life in those years was a torturous endeavor, and I aimed not to allow myself any joy or prospective opportunity beyond the small moves forward I made with my lab. When others asked how my work was going, I said whatever I could to quell the conversation and be done with it. The truth was too painful to speak to anyone. I could barely admit it to myself. It would take 16 years before I uncovered what happened to the being I recklessly and foolishly created. 16 years to learn what had become of the golden-haired child I loved so much. 16 years away from the soulless world I then inhabited. By that time, I had long banished the monster of my early years from my memory as best I could. I assumed the thing had not made it through infancy, given that it was, by my own hand, left out in the elements on the bare earth without nourishment, love, or protection. It was on this day, 16 years later, I would receive a most unwanted letter that it changed the course of my life forever. After a particularly long night at the lab with other specialists, I came home to find a letter from my mother waiting for me. Initially, I was surprised she would send me something by mail, when certainly she could have called me on the phone or sent me an email. But given that I had removed myself from all interaction with my family, I never told her why I stopped coming to visit during the holidays, and she respected my choice by not inquiring further. It may have been the only option she felt she had at her disposal. An unexpected letter from her certainly injected my veins with anxiety. I immediately wondered if something terrible had happened. Whatever I imagined, however, was not remotely close to what the contents of the letter revealed. My dearest Zoel, I hope this letter finds you well. It has been so many years since I have seen your face. Know that I miss you dearly. I wish that I was writing happy news. I know that even if you do not want to see us anymore, you have your reasons, but I feel my obligation to tell you what is happening in our family. I will get straight to point. I don't know what happened between you and Ezra, but he did tell me that you rejected his proposing. Knowing something of what happened between your father and me, I'm sure you know that I can relate to wanting to be independent and think for yourself and your own future. Whatever the case, Ezra eventually moved on and he married a lovely girl. She is called Caroline. The two of them have a sweet little boy, Justin. When I tell you what happened over the last few weeks, you will simply not believe. Even as I write this, my hand trembles because I cannot believe it's true. Justin, just 4 years old, and the most adorable boy you can imagine, went missing one day, in the middle of the night, while Ezra and Caroline were sleeping and the boy was also in bed. The police finally find his body 2 weeks later in the woods close to their house. His lips blue. Can you believe? Who would do such thing? The autopsy report just came back, and I can barely write it out. Report says he was strangled to death. I have not been able to get any sleep in all these days, thinking of who could have possibly wanted to hurt that sweet boy. Well, just yesterday, a new development in case, which I just will never believe is true. The cops search the house and find among Caroline's clothes in her dresser the tiny little locket that has the picture of Ezra as a little boy and Caroline as a young girl. Everyone knows that this is the locket that is so precious to little Justin. That sweet boy refuses to let anyone take off of him, even when he takes bath. I just cannot for a second believe that she would do that to her own child. Why? I saw them just last year for holidays, and she could not have loved that boy more. But you know how the cops are. They took her away, and now we are trying to get money together for the bail and waiting for trial, where I hope this will all be cleared up. Please think some good thoughts for Ezra and his Caroline during this whole nightmare. I know you are so busy with your important work, but I hope that I can hear from you, if only to help console my peace of mind. You are our only hope. Love, Ma." Even though I had not thought of the thing in so long, I had no doubt in my mind who it was that had caused this disastrous end for such an innocent child. It had been 16 years since I thought of that fateful night when I left that infant deserted and hideous on the ground outside the hospital where Hannah had died. It had been 16 years since I thought about what Ezra had done with his foolish vengeance, and how I had enabled Ezra's darkness to live on through me and my ridiculous pride. I had only hoped that the child had not lived long in this life, having left it in the woods with just a sheet for warmth. It was a shameful wish, but one I believed was for the good of mankind. After a wretched sleep, I woke to a beautiful spring day, but it was not one that I could enjoy. I was now marked with the blood of 2 people on my hands, and no one to share this evil with, for who would believe me? I could just imagine how my mother would look at me if I explained that Ezra had done what Ezra had done, and told her how I had abandoned this monstrous child in the woods. If she did believe me, a scenario I could not envision as remotely possible, would she have me sequestered in a psychiatric ward? Maybe it's what I deserved, but what good would that have done? Ezra would still be out there. The demon I had created would still roam the streets seeking revenge for its wretched life. I rationalized that it would not stop until I was able to find out what it wanted. Feverish and somewhat delirious from the contents of my mother's letter, I called into work to tell my staff I could not support them that day, as I had a family emergency requiring my immediate attention. I almost laughed out loud over the phone, thinking how banal a phrase that had suddenly appeared, and yet no other seemed more appropriate. I stole into the very same grove I had sought out so many years ago to cradle the dark, dirty secret of my ambition. I couldn't imagine that it would still be there after all this time, but I couldn't think of anywhere else to start my search. I knelt next to the patch of dark earth that once held my creation. I placed my hand on it gently, with a vulnerability I wished I had been able to grant my own child. If a child you could possibly call it. I tried to imagine what it would look like now, how much more hideous it had become in the last 16 years, but it only caused me further anguish. As I rose from my position on the ground, I heard a rustling behind me. I darted around quickly, certain it was the blood I had rejected so long ago. I could barely make it out, but what I saw frightened me. It was an enormous shadow concealed by a copse of trees. The mysterious form was the size of a wild bear, but had the height of a giraffe. I was absolutely convinced it was my creation, dark and twisted as I would never have anticipated. I was barely able to take in all of its dimensions before the shadow suddenly vanished, and I was left alone in the woods again.